What if you found a teacher who saw your spark when no one else did, shivering on a cracked Wilmington sidewalk, clutching a torn grocery bag, her pension too thin for food and pills? That's the blow. Michael Jordan, the clutch king who turned rejection into rings, took one icy winter night. Dusk bleeds purple, wind rakes bare trees, and Michael Jordan's midnight Bentley hums past, fresh from his basketball camp. He's chasing quiet, until he sees her. Frail, silver hair fraying, she fights spilling cans on a curb of shattered dreams. Her coat's a ghost, and her struggle stops him cold. Michael Jordan slams the brakes, horns scream, but he's deaf to them. "Let me help, ma'am," he says, kneeling in the dirt, voice steady like Game 7. "These old bones don't hold," she mutters, eyes down, until they lift. "Michael Jordan," she gasps. His heart lurches. Mrs. Winters. Eleanor Harding, his fourth-grade rock, who caught him crying post-varsity cut, handed him a note: "Failure's not the fall, it's staying down." That fueled 6 rings, a billion-dollar empire. Now, at 78, she's counting pennies in a town that forgot her, and Michael Jordan's world cracks. This isn't just kindness, it's a reckoning. What he does next sparks a billion-dollar war on teacher poverty, shaking America. And her secret? It ties to Michael Jordan's hardwood glory, a twist that'll break you and heal you. You're not clicking off, this bites deep. Where are you watching from today? Drop it below, let's connect. Who's your teacher who bet on you? Name them, I want to know. Would you lift them up or walk away? Tell me, dig in. Smash that like if this hits hard. Subscribe to Motivation for Success, soul-shaking stories every week. Hang on, Michael Jordan's rawest plays coming fast. Have you ever driven into a place that used to be your entire world, only to discover that time, progress, and life have spun forward, leaving you feeling both at home and like a stranger at the same time? That was precisely how Michael Jordan felt as he navigated his black Escalade through the streets of Wilmington, North Carolina. Crisp winter air rolled across the hood, and the SUV's engine gave a low purr as he passed through neighborhoods that had shaped his childhood. He'd first learned to dribble a basketball on these very sidewalks, sometimes with skinned knees and a stubborn grin. Now, the city sported glossy coffee shops and chic boutiques. Even the corner store that once sold him candy for a few nickels was transformed into a high-end sandwich shop. Life had moved on, and so had he. Perhaps that's why, as he tapped his fingers in time with the car's blinking turn signal, a twinge of nostalgia wrapped itself around his heart. The reason for his return was twofold. On one hand, his foundation was scouting locations to build a brand new youth center, something that could serve as a lifeline for kids much like the one he'd been. A safe place with basketball courts, after-school tutoring, maybe even an open mic stage for the artistically inclined. On the other hand, thoughts of a tech merger back in Chicago tugged at his mind like an annoying gnat, irritating, persistent, impossible to ignore. He was still lost in thought when the scenery around him began to shift. Where there had been neat lawns and sparkling storefront windows, there were now cracked sidewalks and run-down buildings. Old neon signs buzzed in front of bodegas, while fewer cars lined the streets. Nightfall approached, painting the sky with a bruise-like shade of purple. The temperature dipped just enough to make his breath hang in the air. What had once been a vibrant part of his childhood now struggled under the weight of neglect. At a red light, Michael gazed through the tinted windows. 2 children, their jackets too thin for winter, bounced a deflated basketball off the curb. A mother with a weary expression navigated a stroller over potholes, the wheels clattering noisily. Then, off to the side, he spotted an elderly woman bracing herself against the wind. Her frayed blue coat hung unevenly off her hunched shoulders, and she was juggling grocery bags that looked moments away from splitting. One bag finally gave in, sending a can rolling across the street. Without a second thought, Michael guided the Escalade to the curb. Horns erupted in a chorus of frustration behind him, but he ignored them. He stepped out into the cold, lungs drawing in a sharp breath. Stooping, he grabbed the runaway can. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," he said, voice rich and steady. The woman lifted her head, revealing kind eyes dulled by hardship. Her gloved hands trembled, and her thin lips quivered in relief. "Thank you, son," she murmured. He gathered the spilled items, a can of soup, some peas, and a piece of bruised fruit. Despite living in a world of mega sponsorships and business ventures, something deep in his chest stirred at the sight of such simple groceries. Finally, the woman met his gaze. She stared, blinking as though uncertain her eyes were telling the truth. "Michael? Michael Jordan," she whispered. For a second, the rest of the world seemed to fade. He swallowed, mouth suddenly dry. Yes, he managed. "I'm Michael Jordan." She took a step closer, eyes widening. "My goodness. You probably don't remember me." But he did. Though her hair was thinner, her frame more fragile, the memory clicked into place like a puzzle piece. Mrs. Eleanor Harding, his fourth-grade teacher at Ogden Elementary. She had spent countless afternoons explaining fractions, turning endless chalk dust into knowledge that sank into his brain. And, when he was 15, heartbroken after being cut from his high school varsity team, she was the one who found him hiding in the bathroom, tears staining his cheeks. She pressed a note into his trembling hands that read, "Failure isn't falling down, it's staying down." That piece of paper, faded and creased, was still tucked away in a shoebox under his bed to this day. He blinked, emotions clashing inside him, gratitude, disbelief, sadness. "Mrs. Harding," he breathed. I don't even know what to say." Her face crinkled into a warm, if somewhat frail, smile. "It's been a long time, Michael." He took in the weariness etched into her features, the lines of struggle carved around her eyes. He offered to carry her groceries, insisting he drive her home. Pride flickered across her face, but the practicality of the situation won out. She slid into the passenger seat of the Escalade, eyes trailing over the expensive interior. As he started the engine, an ache spread through his chest, because their lives had diverged so drastically that it seemed almost unfair. "Where to?" he asked gently. "Pinewood Apartments, on Elm," she replied. Michael's heart sank. Pinewood Apartments had been crumbling for decades. Even back in his youth, it was spoken of in hushed, pitying tones, a place people ended up, not somewhere they aspired to be. The building loomed ahead like a discolored brick monolith. Rusted fire escapes hung precariously from the walls, and several windows were patched with cardboard. A flickering overhead light in the parking lot half-heartedly tried to stave off the gathering darkness. "You live here?" Michael asked, trying, and failing, to hide the note of alarm in his voice. Mrs. Harding pressed her lips together. "Yes, Michael. It's affordable for me." He said nothing, but the weight of this reality pressed on him like a heavy bench press bar. Together, they climbed 3 flights of stairs, the elevator having been out of order for who knew how long. Every groan of the building's structure felt like an indictment, and he kept worrying she might trip on the uneven steps. They stepped inside a tiny apartment, its walls painted a dull beige that had seen better days. Faded curtains drooped around the lone window, and a bucket in the corner caught water dripping from the ceiling. Books, school textbooks, novels, children's stories, were stacked neatly on the floor, on tables, along shelves. Everywhere. It was a teacher's sanctuary in the midst of disrepair. "Let me make you some tea, Michael," Mrs. Harding offered. Her voice held a practiced warmth, as though no amount of adversity could fully strip away the caretaker in her. He accepted, sinking into a worn armchair that sighed under his weight. She returned with a chipped mug, steam curling into the chilly air. He spotted a framed photo on a side table, the glass reflecting the overhead light. Carefully lifting it, he saw a class photo, him at age 9, skinny arms and beaming grin, surrounded by classmates who were mostly strangers to him now. Mrs. Harding stood at the far left, the pillar holding them all together. "You kept this?" he asked softly, tracing the outline of his own face under the glass. She nodded, easing into her own seat. "That was one of my favorite classes," she said. "All those bright eyes. All that hope." He swallowed, mind a jumble of memories. He'd had legendary coaches and countless achievements, but the gentle encouragement he'd received from this woman burned brighter than any sports highlight reel. "How long did you teach?" he asked. 40 years, she answered, holding her mug with a slightly trembling hand. "I loved every second of it, except maybe grading papers," she added with a small laugh. 40 years. A wave of sadness rolled through him. "Mrs. Harding, are you okay? Financially, I mean." Her smile faded, eyes flicking to the peeling wallpaper. "I manage, Michael. My husband passed away a few years back, and the medical bills," she shrugged, as though that alone explained this meager living situation. "My pension is modest at best, and Pinewood is what I can afford." He felt a surge of indignation on her behalf. A woman who dedicated her life to molding young minds shouldn't be counting pennies for rent. But before he could voice this frustration, she changed the subject. "So, what brings you back here after all this time?" He explained the youth center project he was planning. With every word, her eyes lit up a little more, though exhaustion lingered beneath. "That's wonderful, Michael," she said, setting her mug down. "An opportunity for kids to discover something bigger than their circumstances, like you did, all those years ago." He nodded, mustering a tight smile. "Yeah." In truth, his thoughts were already spinning, "This isn't right. She gave me so much, and now she's here, struggling." That night, after walking back downstairs and sliding into the driver's seat of his SUV, he stared at the battered facade of Pinewood Apartments. The memory of Mrs. Harding's shaky hands and thin voice played on a loop in his mind. Finally, he whipped out his phone and called his assistant. "Tristan," he began, speaking firmly, "cancel my meetings tomorrow. And get me every piece of information you can on teacher pensions and housing assistance in North Carolina." "Sir." Tristan sounded perplexed. "Just do it," Michael said, voice resolute. "There's something important I need to handle." Morning arrived with a washed-out sun behind gray clouds. Michael texted Mrs. Harding, inviting her to breakfast at a simple diner near Market Street. When he arrived to pick her up, she wore the same tattered coat, but this time with a bright blue scarf. He guessed it was her best attempt to look dressy for their meal. That thought alone made his heart tighten. The Market Street diner was exactly as he remembered, a few ripped vinyl booths, the smell of frying bacon and strong coffee hanging in the air. A waitress stammered when she recognized him, but his kind, "Hello, just coffee, please," calmed her jitters. Over pancakes and oatmeal, he gently pushed for the details of Mrs. Harding's life since retirement. She spoke of her late husband's illness, the house they'd loved but had to sell to cover medical bills, and finally the meager pension she received after 4 decades of teaching. Some months, she confided, she had to choose which prescription to refill. Other months, she cut down on groceries to pay the gas bill. Michael felt each revelation like a physical blow. He'd confronted towering basketball rivals, fierce business negotiations, but this helplessness was new. Part of him wanted to yank out his wallet right there and shove a blank check across the table. But he knew her sense of dignity mattered. She wasn't a charity case, she was his teacher, someone who had once believed in him unconditionally. They stopped at a pharmacy next. He stayed in the car while she went inside. Through the tinted glass, he saw her slide a few crumpled bills across the counter. The pharmacist shook his head apologetically. She left with a smaller bag than expected, and her attempt at a smile broke his heart. All settled, he asked softly once she climbed back in. One of my prescriptions was out of stock, she lied. I'll come back next week. He didn't press her, didn't want to shame her, but the realization that she had to skip a potentially vital medication lit a fire in his belly. After dropping her off, he lingered in front of Pinewood Apartments, the building's decay a silent reproach. He made another call to Tristan, this time asking for a real estate contact, an elder care lawyer, and more. If she wouldn't accept direct charity, he'd find a way to help without bruising her pride. Over the next few days, Michael Jordan moved heaven and earth. First, he purchased a modest, cozy single-story house in a safer neighborhood, a place close to grocery stores, her church, and whatever medical facilities she needed. He quietly arranged a trust fund to cover her bills, disguising it under the umbrella of a lifetime achievement grant for educators. He knew she'd balk at a flashy mansion or direct handout. This was more discreet, more respectful. But even as he helped Mrs. Harding, he discovered her story was heartbreakingly common. Dozens upon dozens of retirees, teachers, social workers, community volunteers, were scraping by on paltry pensions, often pushed into substandard living. They were the people who had nurtured, guided, and disciplined children for decades, yet society treated them as an afterthought. Furious and inspired in equal measure, he decided to expand the mission of his foundation. He named the new initiative the Second Bell Foundation, symbolizing that a teacher's work doesn't truly end when the school bell rings for the final time, nor should their support vanish upon retirement. Quickly, he rallied others to the cause, fellow NBA legends, star athletes from other sports, movie stars, tech billionaires. Nearly all of them had at least one story about a teacher who changed their life in ways no statistic could ever measure. They donated millions. News of the Second Bell Foundation's rapid growth and enormous donations spread quietly at first. Michael was adamant that publicity wasn't the goal, he genuinely wanted to help teachers, not soak in the limelight. Then an assistant accidentally CC'd a local reporter on a private email. Within a day, headlines blazed, Michael Jordan launches secret foundation for teachers. Camera crews flocked to Pinewood Apartments, hoping to film the sorry conditions from which Mrs. Harding had been plucked. The sudden media frenzy shocked Mrs. Harding. She called Michael in tears. "They're asking me if this is just a public relations stunt. They even suggested I was part of a calculated plan to make you look good." Michael felt a stab of guilt. "I never wanted that, Mrs. Harding. I'm sorry. I only wanted to help." Her voice trembled with vulnerability. "Maybe we should pause all this. I just can't handle the cameras at my door." He hung up feeling more defeated than after any championship loss. Even the rings that once gleamed in his trophy case seemed to glare at him in judgment. He paced his office late into the night, phone in hand, remembering the note, "Failure isn't falling down, it's staying down." It was as if he heard Mrs. Harding's long-ago voice encouraging him not to surrender now. Finally, he booked a last-minute flight to Wilmington. Showing up unannounced at her new home, he found Mrs. Harding on the small porch, a watering can in hand, tending to the rose bush he'd planted for her. "Michael," she said, startled, setting aside the can. He stood before her, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he repeated, voice hoarse. "The world's turned this into something ugly. You taught me never to quit, so I flew out here to show you that I'm not quitting on you." Tears pooled in her eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Come inside." They talked for hours, the hush of the neighborhood settling around them as if to shield their conversation from the glare of the media. He explained everything, the well-intentioned secrecy, the accidental leak, the new wave of donors who wanted to honor their own cherished teachers. Eventually, her frustration dissolved into quiet understanding. "I do know who you are, Michael," she said. "I was just frightened." It was enough of a green light for him to push forward. Days later, they held a joint press conference at Ogden Elementary's gym, the very place where he once learned the fundamentals of both math and dreaming big. Cameras lined the perimeter, capturing every word. Michael Jordan stood at the center of the gym, basketball banners waving overhead. He spoke with the deep conviction of someone who'd experienced the transformative power of a teacher firsthand. "This isn't about my name," he declared to the cameras. "It's about the people who shaped us. People like Mrs. Harding, who dedicated their lives to guiding kids, only to be forgotten once their careers ended. The Second Bell Foundation is my promise to them. My promise that they won't be left behind." An emotional hush fell over the crowd. Mrs. Harding joined him, trembling slightly, but resolute. She peered into the sea of onlookers, media, and curious bystanders. "I taught Michael Jordan fractions," she said, voice wavering. "He's showing me, and so many other teachers, that we're not alone." The ovation that followed was thunderous, echoing off the gym walls just as cheers had once erupted for Michael's game-winning shots. But this was different. It wasn't about sports glory. It was about recognizing a moral debt, a societal obligation to those who'd given so much. As media outlets picked up the story, a national conversation ignited about teacher pay, pensions, and retirement security. State representatives and local policymakers stepped in, spurred on by public support. The floodgates opened for reforms, better pensions, more robust healthcare options for retired educators, and local initiatives ensuring that a teacher's golden years weren't filled with the fear of unpaid bills. For his part, Michael Jordan never claimed to be a savior. Rather, he insisted he was just paying back a fraction of the immeasurable debt he owed to the mentors who shaped him. He funneled a substantial portion of his wealth into the Second Bell Foundation, while continuing to gather funds from other philanthropic celebrities and ex-athletes. They built new housing complexes specifically designed for retired educators, complete with on-site medical staff and free transportation. They established scholarship programs for children and grandchildren of retired teachers, ensuring that the ripple of kindness extended beyond a single generation. And perhaps the most powerful image of all was the day Mrs. Harding visited one of the new teacher residences, not as a resident but as an honored guest. She stood in a sunlit common room, watching newly retired teachers settle into safe, comfortable apartments they could actually afford. A tear slipped down her cheek, and when someone asked her if she was okay, she simply replied, "I'm just remembering all the times a child looked up at me for guidance. Now, finally, there's someone looking out for us, too." For those who wonder whether such acts of gratitude can truly change the world, remember that every grand movement starts with a single spark. In this case, it was a note pressed into the hands of a teenager who felt like a failure. Years later, that teenager grew into a legend, carrying the spark of gratitude like a torch to light the path for so many others who had sacrificed and given so much. Now, Dear listeners, let's bring this back to you. What teacher or mentor in your life deserves to hear how much they've impacted you? Have you thanked them lately or offered some small token of your appreciation? It doesn't have to be grand, maybe just a heartfelt letter, a phone call, or a personal visit if possible. Let them know how vital they've been to your journey. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might also be inspired. And if you want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to Motivation for Success. Here, we believe in stories that move us toward empathy, understanding, and positive change. After all, a single spark can become a roaring flame when enough hearts join the cause. Remember, no matter how high you climb or how far you go, the hands that first lifted you up deserve your gratitude. Let Michael Jordan's story remind us that we all carry the power to repay kindness, sometimes with game-changing results. May it inspire you to think of the people who fueled your dreams, and encourage you to become a spark in someone else's life. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep your heart open, your spirit strong, and never forget the ones who shaped who you are today. This is Motivation for Success, signing off with a challenge: take action, share your gratitude, and be the hero of someone else's story. Because as we've just seen, an act of compassion in the present can echo well into the future, transforming not only our own lives, but the very foundations of our communities.